In 1565, a man named Richard Walwyn was arrested in London for wearing what the authorities described as a great and monstrous, outrageous pair of trunk hose. Now, trunk hose, for those of you who don't have a pair in your closet already, are these puffy pants, and they were all the rage in Tudor-era England in men's fashion. But they could get you into trouble. Walwyn, for his part, had his pants confiscated by the authorities and exhibited in a public place as, I quote, an example of extreme folly. Now, laws like this were not unique to Tudor England. In fact, the fashion police were hard at work all over Western Europe, in France, Spain, and cities up and down the Italian peninsula. The authorities were passing laws, sometimes several in a single year, regulating what people could wear. Now, you may be thinking, okay, well, that's an interesting history lesson, but it has nothing to do with us today. We don't do anything like that now in our enlightened era. Well, I'm afraid we do. I mean, in fact, in the United States today, in the 21st century, people lose their jobs. They can be sent home from school, kept off of public transportation, sometimes even thrown in jail just for what they're wearing. For example, in 2015, a high school student named Stephanie Dunn was sent home from school in Kentucky for wearing a scandalous shirt that revealed her collarbones. And in 2012, an Alabama judge actually sentenced someone to jail for wearing sagging pants. You are in contempt of court, the judge said, because you showed your butt in court. I'm a law professor, and I teach about civil rights and race and gender discrimination, and I've been surprised at how many laws and lawsuits and legal disputes involve what people are wearing. Suits in employment discrimination, suits in the First Amendment, suits by high school students who are sent home from school. And all of these lawsuits and legal disputes got me thinking that there's a lot more to what we wear than just a fashion statement. And often the way the courts addressed these questions left me unsatisfied. The courts would often say, well, fashion is, of course, clothing is trivial, and therefore beneath the interest of the courts, unless, of course, it ties into some other kind of legal violation. For instance, the clothing is meant to express some very clear manifesto-like statement, such as opposition to the draft. Or the clothing is clearly linked to some protected identity like race or sex. And even in those cases, not all the time. And so I wanted to look into the history of rules and regulations about clothing to find out what's really at stake. And my research took me all the way back to the late Middle Ages. And in the late Middle Ages, clothing was a type of credential. It signified social status, rank, and position. People like Queen Elizabeth, for instance, used clothing as a mode of statecraft. And it was quite commented on during her era, the magnificence of her attire, which communicated to everyone who saw her superiority and her right to rule. So she used fashion as a mode of statecraft. And this use of fashion meant that as a type of credential, wearing the wrong clothing was considered a kind of fraud. If Elizabeth's right to rule is symbolized by her attire, it's a social problem if the butcher's wife, for instance, wears similar attire. The Florentine patriarch Cosimo de' Medici once said, "One can make a gentleman with 2 yards of red silk." And so this worry about fashion by fraud, or fraud by fashion, if you will, led the authorities to pass laws regulating who could wear what. And the elite reserved sumptuous attire, fur, silks, jewels, for themselves as a symbol of their superior social position, and forbade other people to wear similar clothing. That's the first part of the story. Now, I want to pause for a moment and tell a slightly alternative version of this story, because in the version of the story I just told you, what's happening is the elite are reserving sumptuous clothing for themselves, and the problem is social upstarts, people from lower orders, trying to pass themselves off as members of the elite. Now, that certainly happened. However, there's another story to be told about this, in which what people like Richard Walwyn, with the outrageous trunk hose, what he was really doing wasn't trying to pass himself off as an aristocrat, but trying to assert his own importance as an individual and as a member of a new and rising social class of wealthy and skilled tradespeople and merchants. And this is also happening at this period of time. The economy is booming, and people are acquiring new wealth. And so this story is a story of the link between clothing and attire and an emerging ideal of individualism, where the individual, rather than the social class or social position, is what's paramount. And that's the story, a parallel story to be told about the development of dress codes and laws about fashion. I'm going to return to that in a little while. So the story of the relationship between social status and clothing, the first story involves the elite, men and women, wearing elaborate and sumptuous attire. And one of the interesting things about this period in history, right up into the late 1700s, is that the most fashionable people are men. Fashion changes happen first for men. They're most dramatic for men. Women's fashion tends to follow male fashion, and so fashion-forward women adopt aspects of men's attire. Sumptuousness, opulent display is all first and foremost a men's game. This is a picture of a military officer and diplomat in the Holy Roman Empire. And this is the height of elite masculine fashion in 1750. He brought eyelash curler, blush, rouge onto the field of battle. It's reported that he needed 4 flunkies to dust him with powder in his field tent on the field of battle. So this is the height of masculine fashion at the time. All of this opulent display is certainly not unique to women. So what changes? Why is it that now women are fashionable and men generally are not considered to be fashionable? It's not part of typical masculine virtue. Well, in a period of, in some places, as little as 30 years, we go from this as the height of masculine fashion to this. Now, this may still look pretty dressed up to you, but at the time, it's the height of understatement. This is a portrait of Beau Brummel, known as a paragon of masculine vanity. But what he was actually known for at the time was the understatement of his dress. So as compared to this, now you move to this. It's a period in history which a later dress reformer described as the great masculine renunciation. So what's happening is that men are getting rid of the jewels and the brocade and the ceremonial swords and the makeup and the high heels. And by the way, high heels were originally a masculine fashion, not a feminine one. All of that is being cast aside, and they are instead turning toward sober, streamlined, seemingly practical attire. Now, elegance and understatement are the key factors of masculine fashion. And pretty soon we don't call it masculine fashion anymore. Men aren't fashionable, they're simply well-dressed. Women are fashionable. So fashion is handed off to women. this reflects a change in social ideals. So, as this change is happening, the other thing that's happening is that the era of absolute monarchs is coming to an end. Charles I is executed in England, and when Charles II is restored to the throne, he realizes the mistakes of the past, and he begins to adopt a new type of courtly attire that's streamlined. Meanwhile, the aristocracy, rather than going to elaborate court rituals, they're in the country, and they're wearing streamlined clothing that now symbolizes a new kind of elite status. I'm a country gentleman in my practical attire that I can use in the countryside. Here's an example that really demonstrates the relationship between political ideals and clothing. English gentleman in the mid-1700s travels across the English Channel to France. And in France, of course, there's still a leader who styles himself as an absolute monarch, and all of the courtly rituals are in place. They're gone in England. So he goes across the Channel. He's an aristocrat. He's got to dress like French aristocrats in France. And he says this about having to wear this elaborate clothing. I felt so deprived of my liberty that I felt as if I had been placed in the Bastille. And I longed for my little frock coat, which is a coat more like this one, for it places a man under no great restraint, but leaves him free to do as he pleases, much as our glorious Constitution. So right there, he's made the link between the changes in political ideals in England and clothing. And this type of link continues. And so you see it, for instance, in the French Revolution, where the difference between the revolutionaries and the loyalists is described in terms of whether they're wearing stockings or not. The stockings are the sign of the aristocrat, and pants more like this are the signs of the revolutionary class. Thomas Jefferson brings this back to the United States, and it becomes a new style in the United States, pants more like this, trousers. Okay, so this is all happening, these changes that are reflecting the emergence of Enlightenment values, and to some extent social egalitarianism, because for the first time, a head of state is dressed in more or less the same type of clothing as a clerk. This is new, and it's striking. And these old laws regulating what people can wear according to social status are going away. Now, we still, of course, have status represented, but it's represented by subtleties of detail. I don't want to suggest that men's fashion at this period of time, or even today to some extent, is not elaborate. It's just that all of the elaborate work is hidden in the construction of the garment. But men are getting this new, streamlined, sort of heroic silhouette, so that the new tailored suits with padded shoulders and nipped waist and lots of construction, but only on the inside where you can't see it, can make even a middle-aged law professor who works out less than he should, it's even flattering for someone like that. Now, this is not happening for women. Women, quite the opposite, are consigned to what's essentially anachronistic dress. They're continuing to wear draped garments, which are the garments that were worn in antiquity, and until the birth of fashion in the late Middle Ages. But women in trousers are a social scandal. Even up to the early 20th century, a woman could be arrested for wearing pants. Their silhouette changes radically. So sometimes in a neoclassical form, it is somewhat streamlined and unadorned, but in an anachronistic style, the style patterned on the actual clothing that women wore in the ancient world. Men, on the other hand, have this modern silhouette. So there's a gender story to be told here. Now, women continue to wear clothing somewhat like this for quite a period of time. Now, this is the cage crinoline, and this was an advance for women's fashion. The feminist dress reformer Amelia Bloomer actually considered this to be an advance as compared to what came before, which were layers and layers and layers and layers of petticoats to puff the skirt out. Now we have a steel cage that can make the skirt wide without all those layers. It's lighter, it's easier to walk around in. Lots of jokes made about it. In this case, she's hiding her adulterous suitor underneath the skirts of petticoats. People talked about women smuggling contraband underneath the crinoline. there was a whole epidemic of crinoline fires during this period of time, because the downside of the crinoline was with all that air underneath there, it easily fed a fire, and if they brushed past an active fireplace with this very wide skirt, they didn't notice where the back is, they'd catch on fire. And it was actually quite tragic, but it reported this number of crinoline fires. Again, women wearing pants was a scandal. Amelia Bloomer tried to get that to stick with the bloomers, which were a kind of modified women's trouser. And it caught on. It was a big fashion craze for about 6 months, and then it was ridiculed out of existence. This is an early 20th century magazine. It's a salacious magazine. And what the fetish is, it's women in trousers. A woman in trousers was described as a bifurcated woman. And so, nothing, they're not see-through, they're not especially tight, they're just men's trousers. A real sexual fetish, and one that could get you arrested in the streets of many cities. So, there's a great masculine renunciation, which reflects new civic ideals and a new form of civic virtue, but not for women. What finally begins to change? It's actually not the political manifestos of committed feminist dress reformers like Amelia Bloomer. She tries, and it doesn't take. What takes is when women turn it into fashion. So the flapper era could be described as the great feminine renunciation. Finally, women get to get rid of all of the thick, heavy skirts. Their outfits become streamlined. It's a new athletic silhouette. Now, often the stereotype of the flapper is someone like Daisy Buchanan, a frivolous, wealthy, aristocratic woman who spends her time drinking speakeasy gin and driving around in fast cars and dancing to jazz. But actually the flapper fashion started with working class women. There were women who were working in factories after World War I. It was a racially diverse group. African American women were key early movers in developing this kind of streamlined flapper fashions, and it trickled up. So this was an example of the elite copying the fashions of the working class that were seen as liberated. So these are now, there was a statement of women's liberation. It was a statement of women's liberty to pursue the kinds of opportunities, both in terms of employment and in terms of recreation and fun, that had historically been reserved to men. So there's a symbolic statement there. Flapper fashions were so controversial that they were banned in many workplaces. And they were banned for two contradictory reasons. Some people said, oh, these fashions, they're so drab and masculine and uninviting that these poor women will never find a mate. It's tragic. They cut their hair short. There's an F. Scott Fitzgerald story called Bernice Bobs Her Hair, which is about she's tricked by a social rival into cutting off her beautiful long hair into a bob, and of course her life is ruined after that. So there's that narrative. Don't let your daughter become a flapper, she'll never attract a man. On the other side, there's the idea that flapper fashions were scandalously attractive, criminally attractive. So much so that these women, look at they're dressed, you can see their bodies, you can see the outlines of their curves. It'll drive men to distraction. One commentator actually said, if women are going to walk around dressed like this, we have to repeal all laws against rape and sexual assault, because no man could be expected to behave himself when confronted with a woman dressed in such scandalous attire. And so we've got these two different narratives. The key point is that people found this very threatening. It was a threat to a social order that was based on a particular type of gender hierarchy and a particular very circumscribed role for women, and yet it caught on. And it caught on because it was introduced not as a political statement, but as fashion. And that's an example of the power of fashion, and one of the reasons that dress and dress codes matter. I'm going to fast forward and talk a bit about what happens in the mid-20th century with questions of race? Well, before I fast forward, I'll mention this. I'll go back in history to 1740. In 1740 in South Carolina, there's a law called the Negro Act. And it states, no Negro or slave shall dress above their condition. And then the law specifies that Negroes and slaves may only wear coarse cloths of the type that are suitable to working people. Now, at this period of time, one thing that's happening is that there are a group of black slaves, particularly in cities, that have some disposable income and they're buying nice clothing, just like anyone else with disposable income did at the time. It was a sign of social status. They were doing all sorts of interesting things. Sometimes they may have just been copying the European elites. Other times they were wearing them in ways that could be seen as almost a critique, almost kind of mocking. But this was considered quite scandalous in a context in which there were many poorer whites who couldn't afford the kind of clothing that these African Americans were wearing. And it was written in the press, the scandal of these uppity Negroes wearing fine clothing as if they were some kind of gentleman. It's outrageous. And what about the women? Even worse. And what kind of scandalous relationship must they be involved in order to afford the latest Paris fashions? And so the Negro Act is passed, and this sets the tone for a relationship between race and clothing that carries on well into the 20th century. So even when laws like the Negro Act are repealed, African Americans dressed in refined clothing are the subject of ridicule in the press and targets of angry, violent mobs. There are stories of African Americans getting off of trains after World War I, after serving in the military, dressed in their military dress uniforms and being attacked by racist mobs for being uppity. And so, a well-dressed African American is seen as a threat to a social order based on racial hierarchy. Now, here's the 1960s and the Civil Rights Movement. And during the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, there was essentially a dress code. People wore their Sunday best to protest. There's a woman named Ann Moody who sat in a Woolworth lunch counter in the South and describes how she got her hair set, she put on her Sunday best, a pair of pumps, she went into the Woolworths in order to integrate the lunch counter. Now she knew what was coming. And indeed, she was attacked. People threw ketchup and other condiments and sugar and things on her. But this was a statement and a demand for dignity, this type of attire. Sometimes in today's environment, people describe this with a term called the politics of respectability, and the suggestion is that it's an attempt to ingratiate oneself to the mainstream, that there's something a little bit questionable about it. But that's not what was going on at the time. Quite the opposite. This was seen as a challenge and a threat, and everyone understood the symbolism of well-dressed African Americans presenting themselves in public in a context in which that clothing, along with their actions, was a demand for equal treatment and dignified treatment. So there was a dress code. Practically, if you're just thinking about practicality, wearing your Sunday best to a social protest movement where you know you're going to be attacked by mobs, police dogs, fire hoses, that doesn't make sense. You probably would rather have practical working clothing and low-heeled shoes so you can run away. But this was an important symbolic statement, and everyone understood it. Now here's a new generation. It's 2 years later, but it's a younger generation of civil rights activists, and they're dressed very differently. This is the kids in conversation with their parents. And their position, and these are young men in SNCC, is we need to dress in a way that emphasizes our solidarity with the people we're organizing. We're organizing sharecroppers, we're organizing factory workers. We're not going to come in there in our Sunday best. And so it's a new kind of statement. But once again, this is deliberate. They didn't just get up and roll out of bed and put on whatever. It was a deliberate decision to use their attire as part of their political activism. And this continues, of course, when we look at examples like the Black Panthers, Once again, it's a very different style. It's not Sunday best. It's black turtlenecks. It's black leather jackets. It's natural hair. But it's a deliberate statement. The Black Panthers had a minister of culture. They thought about this. And people gave speeches about the importance of a new Afrocentric aesthetic that would free African Americans from the debilitating psychological desire to try to look like white people. So all of this was an important part of the social justice struggle, and people knew it at the time. I'm emphasizing this in part because I know we live in an era today where people think all of this is trivial. And history demonstrates something quite different. So given this history, it's probably understandable that we still tend to evaluate people and judge them to some extent based on what they're wearing. Whether it's high fashion that you might see on Madison Avenue or the edgy styles of an urban street culture. We think we know something about an individual based on their clothing. And that's probably natural and understandable. The problem is we often get it wrong. And we can make serious misjudgments based on stereotypes or limited experience. For example, a lot of our ideas about what counts as refined or professional dress were established at a time when some groups were excluded from the professions. And so members of those groups just have a harder time wearing something that codes as professional. Think of all the grief Hillary Clinton got about her pantsuits. Bill Clinton didn't have those problems. And in addition, some of our ideas about appropriate dress and grooming are exclusionary in a different way. So a lot of workplaces still have dress codes that forbid braids and locks, styles that are suitable to the texture of African American hair worn by many African American women. Those kind of dress codes are just insulting. And they also put these women to a cruel choice. Straighten your hair with harsh chemicals or cut most of it off. And other people don't have to make that kind of a sacrifice in order to be considered professional. Finally, there are dress codes that are based on stereotypes. So there's still a lot of dress codes that require women, and only women, of course, to wear high-heeled shoes. And women all over the world have started to stage protests against these types of dress codes. Cocktail waitresses in Las Vegas staged a Kiss My Foot protest to protest rules that would require them to work maybe 8-hour shifts on their feet all day in high-heeled shoes. Women at the Cannes Film Festival showed up barefoot in protest of a rule that required women to wear high-heeled shoes there. There was a woman in England who circulated a petition against workplace dress codes requiring high heels, and it made it all the way to Parliament. And in Japan, women have started a new social movement with the hashtag #KuToo. It's a nod to hashtag #MeToo, of course, but #KuToo in Japanese means shoe pain. Okay, so, at this point I imagine some of you are thinking, wouldn't it be better if no one cared about any of this stuff? We could get out of the late Middle Ages where we're still carrying on these kinds of obsessions, and maybe it'd be better if we were all like Mark Zuckerberg, who wears a gray t-shirt every day because he cares so little about fashion. Well, here's what he said about why he wears the gray t-shirt. He said, I'm not doing my job if I spend any of my time on things that are silly or trivial. That's my reason for wearing a gray t-shirt every day. But that doesn't quite sound like somebody who doesn't care about what people are wearing, right? I mean, instead it sounds like someone who's saying that anyone who looks too fashionable, anyone who looks like they care too much is silly and trivial and maybe not doing their job. So that gray t-shirt has now become a symbol of moral virtue and the work ethic. And this has a long tradition in Western fashion as well, all the way back to Thomas More, who suggested wearing plain, natural colored garments would be the clothing choice of utopia, as compared to, of course, what Henry VIII and his court were wearing at the time. So that just kind of becomes a new type of dress code. And in fact, on cue, when Marissa Mayer, the CEO of Yahoo, wore a fashionable dress for a fashion magazine photo shoot, the response was harsh. People said, she looks like she's relaxing or on vacation while everyone else is working. So you're pretending like you don't care what other people are wearing when we so clearly do isn't the answer. And indeed, sometimes getting rid of a dress code introduces a new unwritten dress code that's equally harsh but harder to figure out. For example, the investment bank Goldman Sachs recently got rid of its dress code. But they added in the announcement getting rid of the dress code, we all know what is and is not appropriate attire for the workplace. We all know, do we? And one commentator said, you know, that's what makes Goldman Sachs the best investment bank in the world. Because, you know, if you don't know what to wear, you're never going to master the really hard stuff. The dress code is that you need to dress the way you dress at Goldman Sachs. That's the dress code. So now it started to look like getting rid of the dress code was almost some kind of a test to smoke out the people who weren't savvy enough to figure out what was appropriate to wear on their own. And you know, so rather than ushering in a new era of freedom and relaxation, in fact, it's ushered in just the opposite, a rush to a new type of dress code. And you know, so you've all seen these guys, right? If you go to, there's an Instagram page called the Midtown Uniform. You could look it up. And what it consists of pictures of group after group after group of men in the financial sector wearing basically this exact uniform. And it's quite prescriptive. Even though there's no dress code, it's a Patagonia fleece, a button-down collar shirt, a pair of khakis, a pair of loafers. The fleece could probably be vineyard vines, maybe. It's hundreds of people every day wearing this outfit. So, no dress code, but lots of judgment and lots of regulation and lots of concern. So, it's not an answer to pretend like we don't care about what people are wearing when we so clearly do. And given the long history of the relationship between attire and social ideals and social roles, it's unlikely that we're ever going to get to the point where we really don't care at all what other people are wearing, whether we admit it or not, whether it's written down or not. And you know, let's face it, sometimes it makes sense to draw conclusions from what people are wearing. But the problem is, so often our judgments, when they're ill-considered, because we claim we don't care, because we say that attire is trivial, we default to gut reactions that are based on limited perspectives and stereotypes. So whether it's a written dress code or just an assessment of a stranger, let's all check our biases before we call the fashion police. Thanks.